Chapter 8. The banks of the Saskatchewan River were very steep where the river ran through the prairie to the south of Saskatoon, and about 2 miles downstream from the city was the perfect place for digging caves. Bruce and Murray and I had our summer headquarters down there, in an old cave some hobos had dug a long time ago. They had fixed it up with logs and pieces of wood so it wouldn't collapse. You have to be careful of caves because if they don't look like they have strong logs to hold up the roof, the whole thing can fall down and kill you. This was a good cave we had, though. My dad even came out here and looked at it to make sure it was safe for us. It had a door made of a piece of tin roofing, and there was a smokestack going up through the ceiling. Inside was sort of a bench where you could lie down, and we had two old butter crates for chairs. We put dry hay down on the floor for carpet, and under the hay there is a secret hole where we could hide anything that was especially valuable. The river ran only a hop and a skip and a jump from the door of the cave. There is a big sandbar close by, which made a backwater where the current was slow enough for swimming. Standing right beside the swimming hole was the biggest cottonwood tree in the whole of Saskatchewan. One of its branches stuck straight out over the water, and there were old markings on it where rope had cut into the bark. An Indian who had been chased by Mounties a long, long time ago was supposed to have hanged himself on that branch so Mounties couldn't catch him alive. We used to go to our cave a couple of times a week during the summer holidays, and usually we took the owls along. Wool had learned how to ride on handlebars of my bike, but Weeps couldn't keep his balance there, so we built kind of a box for him and tied it to the carrier behind the seat. Mutt and Rex used to come too, chasing crows whenever they got a chance, or racing away at the prairie after jackrabbits. We would bike out to the end of Third Avenue and then along an old Indian trail that ran along the top of the river bank. When we got close to the cave, we would hide our bikes in the willows and then climb down and the bank and follow the secret path. There was some pretty tough kids in Saskatoon, and we didn't want to find them in our cave if we could help it. Wool loved these trips. All the way out, he would bounce up and down on the handlebars, hooting to himself with excitement, or hooting out any insults to any passing dog. When we came to the place where we hid the bikes, he would fly up into the poplars and follow us through the tops of the trees. He usually stayed pretty close, though, because if he didn't, some would be sure to spot him, and they would call up all the other crows from miles around and try to mob him. When that happened, he would come zooming down to the cave, banging on the door with his beak until we would let him in. He wasn't afraid of the crows. It was just he couldn't fight back when they tormented him. As for Weeps, he usually stayed right in the cave where he felt safe. One summer afternoon, when we were at the cave, we decided to go for a swim. The three of us shucked off our clothes and raced for the sandbar, hollering at each other, "Last one in's a Dutchman!" In a half a minute, we were in the water, splashing around and rolling in the slippery black mud along the edge of the sandbar. It was great stuff to fight with. Nice and soft and slithery, it packed into mushy mud balls that made a wonderful splash when it hit something. Whenever we went swimming, Will would come along and find a perch in the hanging tree where he could find and watch the fun. He would get out on the big limb that hung over the water, and the more fuss and noise we made, the more excited he became. He would walk back and forth along the limb, hoo-hooing and ruffling his feathers, and you could tell he felt he was missing out on the fun. This particular day, he couldn't stand it any longer, so he came down out of the tree and waddled right to the river's edge. We were skylarking on the sandbar when we saw him, so I gave him a yell. "Hey, Wool, come on there! Come on, old owl! Come on out here!" Of course, I thought he would fly across the strip of open water and land on the dry sand bar where we were playing. But I forgot Wool had never had any experience with water before, except in his drinking bowl at home. He got his experience in a hurry. Instead of spreading his wings, he lifted one foot very deliberately and started to walk across the water towards us. It didn't take long for him to find out he couldn't do it. There was an almighty splash and spray flew every which way. By the time we raced across and fished him out, he was half drowned and about the sickest looking bird you ever saw. His feathers were plastered down until he looked as skinny as a plucked chicken. The slimy black mud hadn't improved his look much either. I carried him ashore, and he didn't thank me for it. His feelings were hurt worse than he was, and after he had shaken most of the water out of his feathers, he went galumphing through the woods toward home on foot. He was too wet to fly, without a backward glance. Toward the middle of July, Bruce and I got permission from our parents to spend a night in the cave. Murray couldn't come because his mother wouldn't let him. We took Wool and Weeps with us, and of course we had both dogs. In the afternoon, we went for a hike over the prairie looking for birds. Mutt, who was always running ahead of us, flushed a prairie chicken out of her nest. There were 10 eggs in the nest, and they were just hatching out. We sat down beside the nest and watched. In an hour's time, 7 of the little chickens had hatched before our eyes. It was pretty exciting to see, and Will seemed just as curious about it as we were. Then, all of a sudden, 3 of the newly hatched little birds slipped out of the nest and scuttled straight for Wool. Before he could move, they were underneath him, crowding against his big feet and peeping happily. I guess they thought he was their mother because they hadn't seen their real mother yet. Will was surprised he didn't know what to do. He kept lifting up one foot and then the other to shake off the little ones. When the other 4 babies joined the first 3, Wool began to get nervous. But finally, he seemed to resign himself to being a mother, and he fluffed his feathers out and lowered himself very gently to the ground. Bruce and I nearly died laughing. The sight of baby prairie chickens popping their heads out through Wool's feathers and that great big beak of his snapping anxiously in the air right over their heads was the silliest thing I had ever seen. I guess Wool knew it was silly too, but he couldn't figure out how to get out of the mess he was in. He kept looking at me as if he were saying, "For heaven's sake, do something!" I don't know how long he would have stayed there, but we began to worry that the real mother might not be able to find her chicks. So I finally lifted him up and put him on my shoulder. We went back to the cave for supper. We had a good laugh at Wool, but he had the laugh on us before the day was done. After we had eaten, we decided to go down to the river bank and wait for the sun to set. A pair of coyotes lived just opposite on the opposite bank of the river. And every evening, just as the sun was setting, one of them would climb the little hill and sit there howling. It was a scary sound, but we liked it because it made us feel like it was olden times and the prairie belonged to us and the buffaloes and the Indians and the prairie wolves. Will was sitting on the hanging tree, and Rux and Mutt had gone off somewhere in the hunting trip of their own. It was growing dusk when we heard a lot of crashing in the trees behind us. We turned around just as the 2 big kids came into sight. They were the 2 of the toughest kids in Saskatoon. If they hadn't come on us so suddenly, we would have been running before they ever saw us. But now it was too late to run. They would have caught us before we could get 10 feet. The only thing we could do was sit where we were and hope they would leave us alone. What a hope that was. They came right over, and one of them reached down and grabbed Bruce and started to twist his arm behind his back. "Listen, you little rats," he said. "We heard you got a cave someplace down here. You're too young to own a cave, so we're taking it over. Show us where it is, or I'll twist your arm right off." The other big kid made a grab for me, but I slipped past him, and I was just starting to run when he stuck his foot out and tripped me. Then he sat on me. "Say, Joe," he said to his pal, "I got an idea. Either of these kids tell us where the cave is, or we tie him to that old hanging tree and leave him there until the night with the Injun ghosts." Just then the coyote across the river gave a howl. All 4 of us jumped a little. What with the talk of ghosts? But Joe said, "That ain't nothing, just a coyote howling. You gonna tell us, kid, or do we tie you to the tree?" Bruce and I knew they were only trying to scare us, but we were scared all right. I was just opening my mouth to tell them where the cave was when Wool took things into his hands. He had been sitting on the big limb of the hanging tree, and since it was almost dark by then, he looked like a big white blob up there. I don't think he had been paying much attention to what was happening on the ground below him, but when the coyote howled, he must have thought it was some kind of challenge. He opened his beak and gave the owl a hunting scream. Did you ever hear a horned owl scream? Usually they do it at night to scare any mice or rabbits that happen to be hiding near into jumping or running. Then the owl swoops down and grabs them. If you've ever heard an owl scream, you'll know it's just about the most scary sound in the whole world. When Wool cut loose, it made even my skin creep, and I knew what it was, but the 2 big kids didn't know. Their heads jerked up, and they saw the ghostly white shape that was Wool up there in the hanging tree, and they were off and running. They went right through the poplar woods like a couple of charging buffaloes, and we could still hear them breaking bush when they were half a mile away. My guess is they ran all the way to Saskatoon. When they were out of hearing, Bruce stood up and began rubbing his arm. Then he looked at Wool. "Boy," he cried, "you sure scared those two roughnecks silly. But did you have to scare me right out of my skin, too?" "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo!" Wool chuckled as he floated down out of the tree and lit upon my shoulder.